Next up, we're going to learn 6 new elements. Well, technically we've seen one, which is the H1. So we're going to learn 5 new elements. These all have to do with creating headings. They go from an H1 down to an H6. And these headings are used to add structure to our document, to add, well, headings, and to designate section headings in a document. So when I say a section heading, I'm referring to things like this right here. This is just a random page, the box shadow page on MDN. Doesn't matter if you know anything about box shadows or not. We're going to learn them later. But this is a heading, right? This tells us this is the main piece of content on this page, or the main topic of the page, rather, not the content. This tells us what the whole article is about. So within that, we then have other headings, like this is probably a heading, this is a heading, here's another heading, here's a heading. These are all different headings, and they look slightly different, and they have different sizes, and generally those sizes are going to indicate different levels of structure. So for example, this is some sort of a heading, and then within it, we have smaller subheadings, HTML, and then CSS, and then result. So these are not paragraphs of text. Typically, a heading is a couple words or maybe a line. It can be as long as you want, but it has meaning to it. A heading is supposed to be a section heading that tells you something about the content to follow. And a great place to see headings in action in the real world is to go to Wikipedia, click on any article. Let's look at a morbid article about a helicopter crash here. So this right here would be the main heading of the page, right? That's what the whole page is about, this helicopter crash. But then within it, we then have a chunk about the crash, about the aircraft, about the passengers and crew, the investigation, the reactions, the references. So those would be subheadings. This is the main heading, but these are still headings. They're just not the main heading. Let's take a look at another example. How about Buffalo? Buffalo Bulls. Never heard of Buffalo Bulls. Let's look at the Buffalo Bills. Okay, so again, our main heading for the whole page. And then franchise history is a smaller heading. Logos and uniform is a smaller heading. Rivalries is a smaller heading, but then we have an even smaller heading, divisional rivalries, and then even smaller, Miami Dolphins. So these are all subsections of content, and they each have a corresponding heading that tells you what this section is about. So this is why we have 6 levels of headings, H1 down to H6. And by default, they all have a different font size. An H1 will be the largest font size all the way down to an H6, which is the smallest. But please remember, we can always change the font size. You should not use an H1 just because you want to make something have big text. Only use an H1 when it's appropriate as far as the structure of the page goes. So let's talk about what that structure should be. Let's make our own little baby fake Wikipedia article. Let me get rid of all this stuff in our body. And I'll start, we're going to write an article about my pets. So that's going to be the main topic of the page, my pets. So I'm going to use an H1. An H1 is reserved for the main topic of your page, the very most important section heading. And there's really only supposed to be one H1 per page. There should only be one main topic on your page. Buffalo Bills in this case. That's what the whole page is about. You can put as many as you want. Technically, the browser won't care. But from a meaning perspective and a structure perspective, you should just have one. So that's kind of invalid what I just did. Technically valid, but I wouldn't recommend it. And you can see that it definitely gets a large font size by default. I am way zoomed in, but still compare that to a paragraph if I put one below. By the way, I'm using a shortcut where I just type the name of the tag, like P, and I hit tab. And it makes the tags for me, and then I can start typing. This is a page about my pets. So that's a paragraph. Refresh the page. You can see there's definitely a difference in the font size as well as the font weight. This is bolded. But we can change all of that with CSS. So don't use headings because you want big text. Although often headings are big because they are important, right? This text is bigger than this. And this text here is bigger than a regular paragraph. Anyway, I would use an H1 for the first level of headings. But then let's say I have more content. I'm going to have a little piece of content about my cats. I cannot believe I'm saying this, but I have 4 cats. It's a little excessive, I would agree. I didn't plan on getting 4 cats, but let's say this is the next chunk of content, and I have a whole bunch of stuff about cats. I'm going to do lorem ipsum and just pretend I have more content there. And I want to have a heading to tell everyone this is about my cats. I wouldn't use an H1 because that is supposed to be the main topic of the page. This is a subheading, so I could use an H2, which is the next level down. So an H2 says this is a secondary topic on the page, and in here I'll say cats. And by default, an H2 does get a smaller font size. It's still big and it's bold, but it's smaller than an H1. So then I have my subheading about cats, and then I'm going to duplicate this. Oh, I didn't copy it correctly. Let's try that again. And this time I could have a second section, and this one will be about my chickens. So I have 22 or 23 chickens. I'll say it's also a little excessive. Although chickens, I think it's okay to have a lot, right? They're for eggs. They're not pets necessarily. All right. So I would use an H2 there because this is kind of the same level as this. They're both, if you're thinking in terms of an outline, if I was to outline the structure of my document, I might have my main thing called my pets, and then within that I might have cats and dogs and chickens. But then maybe within cats, I'm going to talk about my different cats. So then I would have a new level of headings. So let's say within cats, I'm going to talk about my first cat named Blue. I have another cat named Cream. I did not name her that. I adopted her with that name. In this case, this would be our main heading, the main topic. These 3 things are on the same level, so they would be an H2. And then these would be an H3 because they are smaller topics. They're kind of nested subtopics beneath an H2. So let me show an example of that. Within chickens, I have a rooster. I actually have 2 roosters. So maybe I'll put another piece of content in here. That will be an H3. And it will say roosters. Paragraph, I have 2 roosters. Both accidents. They were supposed to be hens, but they were sexed incorrectly. So I ended up with 2 roosters, one of which is a complete jerk and attacks me every time I try and fill up their food. And then I can have hens, and that would also be an H3. I have 20 laying hens. Anyway, you don't have to worry about my pets. I'm probably boring you to death, but if I refresh the page, you can see an H3 also is a little bit smaller than an H2, which is also smaller than an H1. So we could go all the way down to an H6 if we had that many levels of headings, but we should never use an H6 if we don't have an H5 and a 4 and a 3 and a 2 and a 1. We shouldn't use an H4 if we don't also have H3s and 2s and 1s. Think of them as nested levels in a hierarchy, an outline of your document. I could technically make this an H6, but it kind of ruins the structure of the document. So the browser doesn't care. There's an H6. It's pretty small, still bolded, but not very big compared to the other headings. And while it's valid, it does mess up the meaningfulness of my page and the structure, because now this kind of implies if someone's using a screen reader or if a web crawler is coming across this page, it implies that there's other headings and that this is less significant than this. But they're supposed to be the same significance, in my case at least, so I would use an H3. So you don't have to get too bogged down in all the rules. The browser doesn't care, really. You can do whatever you want. But the general rule is only one H1 per page. It is the most important topic of your page. So let's just take a look at one more example. If I go to the Mozilla Developer Network homepage, I would imagine this is an H1. I don't actually know that. But if we inspect, it is an H1, as you can see right there. And then the next heading is right here. Right? This is just a paragraph of text, but this is another heading that should be an H2. And that's exactly what it is. So just as an example, you could have made that an H3 or a 4 or a 5, but then the relationship between these two things is messed up. By making it an H2, we're saying this is the next most significant thing or the next subheading below the main topic. So use one H1 per page and then only go in order. Don't use an H3 unless you also have H2s and 1s. So that is a lot about headings, but they are important. They come up all the time. We use them to create section headings and structure a document.